Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the JFK Junior Forum. My name is Alice Kayami. I'm a sophomore in the college studying applied math and government. I'm taking an economics course this fall called American Economic Policy. Currently, we're looking at how the government should prevent and respond to financial crises, inflations, recessions. We're tackling a lot of important questions about inflation right now, how it's impacting the US economy and the global economy. Some questions we're asking is, what is the likelihood that we will enter a recession in the next 2 years? And what will be the impact of Biden's $700 billion Inflation Reduction Act? Last week in class, even just this morning in class, my professor had a lot to say on the topic, and I'm sure he still does. Lucky for you, this evening you too can hear what he has to say without even enrolling in the course. So I'm honored to be presenting tonight's guest, Charles W. Elliott, university professor and director of the business and of the Mustafa Rahmani Center for Business and Government, Professor Larry Summers. Professor Summers has also served in many senior policy positions, including chief economist of the World Bank, director of the National Economic Council for the Obama administration, and Secretary of Treasury for President Clinton. Professor Summers will be joined by Linda Henry, Managing Director of Boston Globe Media Partners and co-founder of Hub Week, a civic organization between Boston Global, Harvard University, Massachusetts General Hospital, and MIT that explores the intersection of art, science, and technology. Welcome again, and without further ado, please join me in a round of applause for this evening's guests. Thank you.
Alice crushed that. She's a sophomore here in the undergraduate school, and she was fantastic, and she's one of your students, obviously.
Absolutely. I'm lucky to have her.
Thank you, Alice, for that warm welcome, and it is great to be with all of you here tonight. It is great to see so many students here in the audience, and we have a lot of people joining us virtually at home from the Globe Summit, and here at this premier place at the JFK Junior Forum. It is an honor to be here tonight and great to be here with you.
Good to be with you, Linda, and good to be with this part of the Harvard community and all your guests virtually.
We're going to talk together here for about a half an hour, and then we're going to open it up to questions. There are microphones on the side, but there's been a lot of news lately, and you've been such a I don't know what the word is, but you've been right, I guess is the right word. You've been right on so much of it, especially back in February when you really predicted what was going to happen with inflation. And you were right as opposed to the Federal Reserve. And I think my favorite quote from you was when you saw the congressional budget. I think you called it the least possible outcome is what they had predicted. So what was it that you saw and that you've been seeing that other people are just not taking into account?
Look, I looked at the data as I saw it 18 months ago in February of 2021. I saw a GDP gap of the United States of perhaps 2 or 3%. And I saw that we were doing 14% of GDP in fiscal stimulus. And I thought to myself, this bathtub is going to overflow pretty badly. And maybe there'll be a bunch of problems with the drains because there'll be a bunch of supply shock problems. But even if they're not, we're likely to be overstimulating the economy, and that's going to generate substantial inflation. And sure enough, before long, we got to a situation where the ratio of vacancies to unemployment was 3 times as high as it normally had been. And everywhere you walked, you saw shortages of labor and you saw bottlenecks, and that was going to be an inflationary environment. And I didn't think that inflationary environment was particularly going to subside on its own volition. And I thought to think that it was just going to kind of go away and we were going to naturally have a soft landing was some kind of triumph of hope over experience. And gives me no pleasure to say, but unfortunately right now and after the latest CPI figure, it doesn't look like we have moved past our inflation problem as a country.
You tweeted today about the PPI number that came out and how it was just a 0.1% change, and you said you didn't really take much comfort in that.
Well, there are different kinds of prices. There's prices like the price of wheat or gasoline, or to some degree airline tickets, and there are prices like the tuition at Harvard. And one kind of price bounces up and down a lot, and the other kind of price reflects an underlying trend and momentum. And what's much more fundamental is the second kind of price. And the examples of that are rents that people are paying. Ultimately, the most fundamental price in the economy is the wages that people are getting. And those prices are running at 5 or 6% a year. The volatile prices were running way up, and so total inflation for a while was running at 9. Then gasoline having gone way up, it's come way back down, so headline inflation runs at a slower rate. But if you want to be thinking straight, you'll kind of look through all that and look at what's happening to underlying inflation. And I think that's running somewhere in the range of 5%, a level where prices double every 14 years, and where everybody's thinking about inflation all the time, and where inflation is eroding people's real wages. And so that's why inflation is the greatest economic concern that Americans are feeling right now. And that's why I think belatedly the Fed has recognized that inflation control has to be its primary policy priority.
The recent Inflation Reduction Act, that $700 billion policy that just went through, my understanding is that some of the research for that in terms of the IRS actually came from your work here at HKS with Natasha Sarin, did here at the Kennedy School. Can you explain that aspect of the research and your contribution to that?
This goes back to when I was Secretary of the Treasury in the 1990s and had responsibility for the IRS, and I've followed it since then. The numbers are kind of stunning. The expected amount over the next decade of taxes that are owed but not collected, because people don't file tax returns when they have to, because people don't report their income, is $7 trillion over the next decade, with the largest share of that coming from wealthy individuals with incomes over $400,000. That would kind of say to you that we ought to have increased enforcement effort. But in fact, the audit rate for people with incomes in the top 1% has come down by 50% since 2012. We've actually been slashing what we do to try to collect taxes. And so it sort of stands to reason. I mean, they've done studies, and the studies show that if you spend on average one more hour auditing millionaire taxpayers, one more hour of auditing produces an average of $4,500 in revenue. Well, they don't pay people who audit anything like $4,500 an hour, I promise. They don't pay them $200 an hour. And so it seems a no-brainer on grounds of revenue collection, on grounds of believing in enforcement of law, and on grounds of believing in fairness, that we should figure out how to do this better. And that means increased enforcement. That means having computer systems which use computer languages that at least some people under 55 know. That means making sure we open all the returns. That means answering the phone when people call wanting to know how to pay their taxes better. And we've basically denuded the IRS with budget cuts, and we probably haven't spent the money we had as well as it could have been spent. And that was the argument that we pushed in the papers we wrote during 2020. And my colleague Natasha, who had been a student here at the law school and in the economics program, has been working in the Treasury Department over the last 2 years, both on making the case for an increased appropriation for the IRS, and on how the IRS can and should be better managed. And I think there's a potential. We're not going to collect all the taxes that are owed but not paid. We're not going to collect half those taxes. But I think there's the capacity to collect hundreds of billions of dollars, and that makes an important contribution to containing budgets. It makes an important contribution to the rule of law, and it makes an important contribution to fairness. And so I think this was the kind of practical problem that is very important to work on.
It's an interesting perspective, because there's a little bit of the perspective that the auditing and sort of the amount of time and energy that goes into the taxes, that could they be investing in simplifying the tax code?
You know, should we simplify the tax code? In a variety of ways, we probably should be simplifying the tax code. But I think that's a separate issue, and it's a quite separate issue from the fact that we have a law and people ought to comply with the law. And if you buy something for $10 and you sell it for $100,000, then you have a capital gain. And if you don't tell the government about that capital gain and you don't pay anything, you are stealing. And we should find that out, and we should penalize you. There are various ways in which you can simplify the tax code, but I think one has to be careful. I mean, for example, a thing people say is, we should simplify the tax code. It's really not very complicated. Somebody said this to me not long ago. If you get money, you have to pay taxes. If you don't get money, you don't have to pay taxes. It's not very complicated. And I said to him, well, that's great. So I got an idea. Why don't we pay for everybody's meals, pay for everybody's houses, pay for everybody's club memberships, and not give them money? And then say they don't have to pay taxes. Is that a good idea? Well, it wouldn't be a good idea. Okay. So if we pay for meals, should I have to pay, if Harvard gives me money for meals, should I have to pay taxes on that? Yeah, probably I should. If Harvard asks me to meet with a donor at an expensive restaurant, and I go to dinner at that expensive restaurant, should it be okay for Harvard to pay for that meal? Yeah, it probably should be. Should we have rules that say when it's okay and when it's not okay? Yeah, we probably should have rules. Well, that's why the tax code's complicated. And so there is this idea that you can just make it simple and reduce it to a postcard. But I promise you, if you do make it simple, there are going to be people who are going to figure out their way around it. And the way it becomes complicated is because of all the clever things that people do to figure out how to avoid paying paying taxes. So can we simplify the code? Yeah, we can. But is it some kind of overarching easy thing that we don't do just because we're stupid? I think there's a lot of simplistic advocacy of simplicity.
I think that's fair. I want to switch gears to the global economy. And so I have some business in the UK, and the news is only about energy prices right now and what's going on there. And so how is what's happening in Europe overall different from what's happening in the US?
Look, we've got real economic problems in the United States. We've got real political problems in the United States. I'm as alarmed about the health of our democracy as I've ever been. But I would rather be playing the hand of the United States than playing the hand of any other major country. And one important respect in which that's true is we are largely self-sufficient in energy. We do import some fossil fuels, but we also export some fossil fuels, and just about balances. Europe, on the other hand, is completely dependent on imports of fossil fuels, and in a decision that in retrospect looks inexplicable, Germany decided to make itself completely dependent on natural gas as the basis of its industry and the basis of heating most of its homes. And then it decided to make itself completely dependent on Russia as a supplier of natural gas. Well, that was asking for trouble if you didn't completely trust President Putin, which was to say it was asking for trouble. And the price of natural gas, which is also the major source for electricity, given that they decided to abolish nuclear power, is up close to tenfold on some ways of measuring it. That is a degree of vulnerability and uncertainty, the likes of which we do not feel here in the United States. From a macroeconomic perspective, it's a really hard problem of policy, because do you raise interest rates and tighten policy because you're going to have a lot of inflation, or do you cut interest rates and loosen policy because you've got a lot less spending because people can't afford to pay for all the natural gas? And so you're kind of stuck either way you go. But from a deeper point of view, it reveals a very high degree of vulnerability. And my best guess is we'll have a recession in the United States, but I'm much more confident that there's going to be a recession and an element of stagflation in Europe that comes as a consequence of what is going to happen as a consequence of the staggering vulnerability that they created for themselves.
You talk a lot about, and it's tattooed in my brain now, inflation above 4%, unemployment below 4%, and what that means. We've had a number of rate hikes, and we're looking for another one at the end of September. If you were in this position, what is your approach? Where are you on the gradualism spectrum for what we should do?
So the thing that you referred to, Linda, was I calculated some time ago that there's never been a moment when we had inflation above 4% and unemployment below 4%, and we didn't have a recession within 2 years. We've never had a moment where the unemployment rate went up by 0.5% without it's also going up by more than 2%. And that's why I think a soft landing for the US economy, unfortunately, represents the triumph of hope over experience. I've learned from painful experience that if the doctor tells me to complete a course of antibiotics, that I should complete the course of antibiotics, and that if I stop the antibiotics at the first moment that I feel better, or at the first moment that I feel a bit of a side effect, what's probably going to happen is my problem, my strep throat, whatever it is going to come back, and it's probably going to be a bit worse the second time because the bacteria are going to be more resistant to antibiotics.
I had that experience with Paxlovid.
Exactly. And I think the lesson applies to monetary policy. If we don't do what's necessary to contain inflation, what will happen is that inflation will go down and then it'll go back up, and people will be less confident about our ability to control inflation. The expectations will become more entrenched, and the inflation will last longer, be higher, and be ultimately more painful to get out of the system. So I think that gradualism and tentativeness are not the right approach. I think we need to be firm and resolute with respect to inflation. What that exactly will mean, I don't think is clear down the road. I think it was very clear that doing 75 basis points, which is what the Fed has now said it's going to do next week, is better than doing only 50 basis points. And I'm sure they're going to have to continue to raise interest rates. Markets have moved quite substantially. Markets which used to think that they were going to take interest rates up to 2.5% or 3%, now think they're going to take interest rates up above 4.30 as part of what they need to do. My guess is that if they want to securely control inflation, they're going to have to raise rates further than that. But that's not a decision they need to make right now. I think it would be helpful if the Fed was more realistic and honest in its projections. And I think the last set of projections that came from the Fed, which said that 2 years from now we were going to have 2% inflation and that the peak unemployment rate was going to be 4.1%. That's something that could conceivably happen, but I don't understand how it could be anybody sensible's best guess as to what's going to happen. And the fact that there are 19 members of the Federal Open Market Committee and they each get to do a forecast, and the most pessimistic one was saying that unemployment would only get up to 4.5%. The most pessimistic of 19 was 4.5%, suggests to me a dangerous degree of groupthink and happy talk that surrounds the process. And I don't think that gives as much confidence as it would be possible to generate.
So what would you urge Biden, if he were here with us today, what would you urge him to do versus Yellen or Powell?
Well, I think the right posture for the president in general with respect to monetary policy is to respect the independence of the Fed and to acknowledge, as he has done, that monetary policy is the right determinant, is the primary determinant of inflation, and it's best to keep politics out of it. And I think the president has done that. I think there are steps that the administration can take that are constructive with respect to inflation, even though less important than what monetary policy does. I think that being focused on containing budget deficits over time, particularly in the near term, is helpful. I think that doing whatever you can do on the supply side is desirable. It's kind of insane that we have trucks and trains carrying oil all over this country rather than constructing pipelines, which would permit accessing more resources, cheaper, safer transmission. It's kind of crazy that we can't, because of NIMBY, because every local thing gets its own veto power, develop transmission lines which would let electricity generated renewably flow more fully around the country. I think in general, we need to regulate when we need to regulate, and we need to not regulate when we need to not regulate. It's kind of a metaphor for this, for me, the Lars Anderson Bridge a few years ago, connecting Harvard Square and the area where the business school is. That bridge was under repair with one lane of traffic closed for 62 months. To put that in some perspective, it took the United States 3.5 years to win World War II. You learn things. You learn things when you're around a university. I talked to some people in the classics department. The Charles River is 360 feet wide. The Rhine River is 3,600 feet wide. Julius Caesar built a bridge across the Rhine. Not repaired a bridge, built a bridge in 9 days. And it took contemporary America 62 months. Well, that kind of constipation in doing things adds to the costs of all kinds of things in our country. And I think if we could pay attention to it, and we could focus on finding places where our system is making everything too slow and too expensive, we could cut costs very substantially. That's true with respect to infrastructure. That's true with respect to approving new drugs. That's true in a whole set of areas. Look, there are, in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, there are 82 people who have the title dean. 82. Now, some of that is about bureaucratization that we could usefully think about, but some of that is about all of the regulations that are imposed on universities that are part of why your tuition is where it is. So I think there's a lot that government can think about. Why is it, really, why is it here now that if British Airways flies a plane from London to Boston and drops off people in Boston and then flies to Los Angeles, because some of the people want to go to Los Angeles, it's not allowed to pick anybody up in Boston? And therefore, there's less competition flying. Is there any excuse for that? I don't think there is. And there are rules like that all over shipping. There are rules like that ubiquitously. So I would urge President Biden to think about a ton of things on the supply side that would make our economy more efficient. Some of them are things like stimulating new technologies in renewable energy and all of that, which will bring down the price of renewable energy. But a lot of it does go to various kinds of regulation. Look, I've got my flaws. I got a lot of problems. There's a lot that's not good about me. But I humbly submit to you that I am qualified to teach economics in a Massachusetts high school. Some of you may disagree, but I suspect the majority of you would agree that all things considered, if I wanted to teach economics in a Massachusetts public school and a Massachusetts public school principal wanted to hire me, that ought to be possible. But without some kind of special exemption and dispensation, that would not actually be possible. And that's a type of thing that's driving up costs. And I think as part of containing inflation, that's something we should very much think about.
I want to open it up to questions. There's microphones here and there if people want to ask. And I think that they want you to go to the microphone because they can hear you. So while you're on your way there, and I'll answer as soon as there's one right back there. You talk about teaching. You are a fantastic teacher because the way you're able to contextualize things. And you're teaching 3 courses this fall. And I know that you are in demand everywhere. Why is it so important to you that you're still teaching?
It's my job. I kind of think that's the job of people who are professors. I find you tend to learn the most about subjects when you're exposed to people who haven't thought about them for years and years, because they tend to ask fresh, new questions that make you think about them in different ways. And that's why for many years I've found the undergraduate teaching I've done most satisfying. And I also find that it forces me to figure out what I think. That if I'm going to teach a class in American economic policy on antitrust policy, I have to figure out what I think about antitrust policy. So I learn a lot in the process of teaching, and I enjoy it. That's why I do it.
Great. So I had a woman who was right here. Oh, there you are.
Beyond energy prices, how do you think inflation is different in America versus Europe? And to what degree is the inflation we're witnessing in America right now the result of the pandemic aid as opposed to the general trend of supply chain issues that we're seeing both in America and around the world?
I think that a large, very substantial part of inflation in the United States reflects the gap between the very large spending that I referred to earlier and the fact that there wasn't that much supply. Sure, there are bottlenecks, but a bunch of the reason there are bottlenecks is that there was so much demand, and when you have so much demand, you're going to have bottlenecks. So I would say in the United States, the largest part by far of the 5 to 6% underlying inflation, I would attribute to demand. I would have a very different view in Europe. In Europe, you have, on the one hand, they provided much less stimulus than we did. So you don't have nearly as tight a labor market with job shortages. You don't have nearly as large an amount of spending supported by having written checks to people. And on the other hand, you have much more high prices being imported. You mentioned energy, which is crucial in it. Another part of it is that because of all of this, the dollar has gone way up relative to the euro. You know, the euro in the day was worth $1.25, and now the euro's worth a bit less than $1. Well, that is holding down inflation here because it makes imported French wines cheaper, and that is increasing inflation there because it makes the price of oil measured in euros higher, and that's a consequence of our policy. So I would say in America, it's more about it's more about demand. In Europe, it's much more about supply, and all things considered, it's better to have put on weight because you were eating too much than to have put on weight because your metabolism doesn't work right. Because if it's because you were eating too much, you can fix it. And if it's because of some biological thing, it's much harder to fix. So all things considered, I'd rather have our problem than have their problem.
I love your analogies. We have a question at this point. If you go to the microphone, if you don't mind, because we have listeners.
Hi, Professor. Thank you both for doing this. My name is Diego, and I'm a MPA student here at the Kennedy School. Two questions on inflation. In the beginning, you said, I think very humbly, that you looked at the data and you concluded that the bathtub would overflow. Many other economists, Paul Krugman, et cetera, looked at the same data and got to very different conclusions. So I was wondering if there's any salient aspect in the data that really called your attention and led you to that conclusion. That's number one. And number two, on China, now with their economic concerns and zero COVID policy, they seem to be moving towards loosening monetary and fiscal policy. I was wondering if you could comment on maybe the macro implications for the U.S., given that the Fed will probably continue to tighten. Thank you.
Look, I think part of the reason, something I've always tried to do, and you can argue about it, I guess, I've always tried very hard to see the world as it is rather than as I want it to be. So I've tried to separate my preferences and my loyalties from my analysis. And so I was a strong supporter of the president and strong supporter of the broad values that his administration brings, and I continue to be. But it still seemed to me that one should follow the logical implications of arithmetic. And I think there are probably too many economists in the world where you can kind of predict where they'll come out on any issue by looking at which side what the two sides are in the political debate in Washington. I've always tried to make sure that my analytical views when I'm in government, I support the people who appointed me. But when I'm out of government, I try to call them like I see them. And I think that helps you be right a higher fraction of the time. I also think there was a tendency, I think it was a misguided tendency, to look at the recent past. And we'd had 40 years when we'd had very little inflation. Everybody who forecast that there would be high inflation turned out to be wrong. And so a lot of people were deterred from forecasting that there would be high inflation. And I think in general, it's a bad idea to be overly a slave of recent history rather than underlying logic in coming to judgments. I think China's going to have a very difficult time. The aging society, the real estate overhang, the magnitude of the financial difficulties, not to mention the various challenges of political economy about trying to have a burgeoning IT sector on the one hand and trying to have a higher degree of political control from the center on the other. I'd be a little surprised if the RMB gained a lot of strength in the period ahead for exactly the reason you say. And I think the desire is towards capital outflows from China. It's going to obviously slow global growth, given that China is a fifth of humanity. Probably a weaker Chinese economy means weaker commodity prices globally, because China has been a major demander of commodities, and that's not all bad from the point of view of inflation. My biggest concern is that a weaker China may well become a more truculent China, because without the glue of tremendous economic growth and progress to keep the society together, there will be a tendency to resort towards nationalism and foreign scapegoating. And that, I think, is going to be a very complex challenge for the global system to manage.
Goes to your perspective of you'd rather deal with the hand here. We have a question up here.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. I was actually in the morning class which mentioned the Caesar analogy, so I really appreciated that part. My question was, so let's say data does point to a recession, and let's say there will be one, for the sake of argument. Then how do we use this crisis, particularly since, you know, part of what we learned in that class was that we are apparently in a Cold War II, so which doesn't mean, you know, any good things for supply chains or global trade and capital markets at all, right? How do we use that crisis and turn it into an opportunity? What policies should, in your recommendation, should the Biden administration or the economic, you know, body enact, either domestically or internationally, to survive this and hopefully come out better than we were, or at least to have learned a lesson?
So I talked about some of the policies in terms of making the economy more flexible and holding down costs and prices, which I think are a response to inflation domestically. You know, a positive kind of example is when I first started traveling from my home in Philadelphia to MIT, where I was an undergraduate. It cost twice as much to fly from Philadelphia to Boston as it did from Los Angeles to San Francisco, even though they were the same distance. And the reason was that it was regulated when you flew from Philadelphia to Boston, and since it was all within one state, it wasn't regulated when you flew from San Francisco to Los Angeles. And the Carter administration, which did many things well and many things poorly, that was something they did well. Interestingly, the two people who drove that were arch progressive Senator Ted Kennedy and then Harvard professor Stephen Breyer, long before he went on the Supreme Court. And that was an example of taking a moment to do something constructive. So I think there's a lot of potential in this moment. I think globally, we need to renew and replenish the global financial institutions. We don't have a system right now that works when countries get in huge debt problems and their debt needs to be restructured, an analog to what we do with bankruptcy for the United States. Everybody wants everybody else to forgive their debt so they can be repaid. We need a better system for working through those kinds of moments of international financial distress. We need much more support than the global development banks now provide for green investments in emerging markets. So I think we have a major opportunity with respect to the global financial architecture that comes out of the challenges of this moment. And I think, shockingly, we are not much better prepared for the next pandemic than we were for COVID. And the right guess is, nobody knows and can know, that a COVID-like pandemic will come again within the next COVID-level pandemic will come again within the next 15 years. And surely we should have production capacity for vaccines, stored huge quantities of masks and syringes, ongoing genetic surveillance so we catch it at the first possible moment. And the world is badly underinvesting in all of those things. So, and I think they have huge consequences. The United States is still, almost 20 years later, much better thought of in Africa because of George W. Bush, his PEPFAR program, which invested massively in containing AIDS. Surely we should have mounted an effort like that with respect to COVID, and we didn't quite manage it. And surely we should with respect to the next pandemic. Perhaps we should with respect to global education, using the capacity of distance education that we're using to cause this program to reach far more people than it would have reached if it had been held 4 or 5 years ago. So I think there are opportunities both globally and domestically for us to respond if we can come together.
I was in South Africa, and I was surprised at the reverence with which they held George W. Bush. It was really this real gratitude and patience. Is that a question in this one? This is our last question, I think, from the audience.
Hello, good evening. My name is Ricardo De La Fuente. I want to thank you to the moderator for doing such a fantastic job, and Lauren Summers for your years of service to the Harvard community and to this nation. So my question is, and during your illustrious career, what was your greatest moment in your professional career? What was your greatest challenge? And despite all this negativity of inflation and recession, what great opportunities lies ahead?
That's a good question.
And what emerging markets or other countries do you think has great potential in the next 10 years?
It's a lot of questions.
I can keep them coming.
I think almost every place has the potential if it can do the right things. I think I'm particularly impressed in today's world by the latent energy that lies within India, and that if India can engage in the right kinds of reforms, can keep itself together as a society, I think there's the possibility of extraordinary growth affecting an extraordinary number of people. I think that it's what I'm a specialist in, so it's what I focus on. But we can manage inflation, we can manage recessions. Hugely important to do it better rather than worse, but it's less fundamental than preventing global pandemics or global climate change or wars. I think for the United States to find a way of being outward looking is really what is probably most important. You know, there are important differences and similarities between being a professor here at Harvard and working in Washington. Two differences that I discovered very, very early on were that as a Harvard professor, roughly speaking, the worst thing you can do is to sign your name to something you didn't write yourself. On the other hand, as a public official in Washington, it's roughly speaking a mark of effectiveness to do so as frequently as possible. And as a Harvard professor, if you try to work on a problem and you think very hard about the problem and you really can't find a good solution to the problem, what you do is you go work on a different problem. And when you're a policymaker, you don't have that luxury. When I came back from Washington after being Secretary of the Treasury to be the president of the university, I thought to myself that I was leaving politics. That was the most naive conception that I ever had. I'm proud of the moments when I was in Washington and I helped to use my expertise to contain global financial crises during the 1990s and to cause there to be a much more rapid recovery than there could have been after the financial crisis in 2008. And I think that could have easily been a much graver situation, but for the courage that President Obama displayed. Here, what probably gives me the most satisfaction is the people I meet who say that but for the reforms we instituted in the early 2000s that enunciated the policy that no one with a family income under $60,000 then, which would be like $100,000 today, had to pay anything at all to come to Harvard, who said that without those policies they wouldn't have had the chance to be Harvard students. That's what probably gives me the greatest satisfaction. It's probably less things that we did than things we were not able to do that in the various roles I've had leave me with the greatest sense of regret. I wish we'd been able to do more during my time in the Clinton administration to cushion the communities that were being wrenched by global trade that was on net bringing enormous benefits, but wasn't bringing benefits to those specific communities. But I think the right general principle, whatever your role is to ask yourself how you can make things better and in what concrete ways you can do things that will cause the world or the thing you have some responsibility for to be better in 2 or 3 years, and then to try to get there. And that's the philosophy I've always tried to bring.
There's one more question, Professor, over here.
Thank you, Professor. You commented earlier on the constipation of NIMBYism and slowing energy infrastructure. I'm wondering, is the permitting reform deal negotiated by Senators Manchin and Schumer, in your view, then the appropriate laxative? And sort of, in general, how essential would you say that permitting reform is to realizing the climate goals of the Inflation Reduction Act?
I think maybe I've gone as far in that direction of metaphor as is perhaps appropriate in a setting of this kind. Is perhaps appropriate in a setting of this kind. I think that, look, I think permitting reform is the right thing. I think that there has been a failure of many in the environmental community to recognize that natural gas is about 75% of the way from coal to renewables. And so if you promote natural gas, most of the time you're doing a good thing rather than doing a bad thing. And I think that in general, given our degree of dependence and given the tremendous adverse consequences, both economically and politically, of major energy spikes, and given that the knowledge that we can increase production and increase production quickly exercises important restraint on others who might be tempted to cartelize energy and raise energy prices, that I think permitting reform is the right thing. And I also think that deals should be kept, and that if this was hugely important legislation for the global environment because of what it would mean for climate change, and if that was the agreement that was reached with Senator Manchin, I think it's appropriate to honor that agreement if you want to be able to make more agreements in the future and get more things done. So I think on both process grounds and on substantive grounds, the permitting reform is right. And I think finally that if you broaden a bit the concept of permitting reform, that permitting reform is also encouraging the permitting of wind power plants and solar power plants, which are an important aspect of renewables. So I'm very much in favor of that kind of reform.
This has been a great conversation, and I get to ask the last question
sure do.
as we're about to wrap up. But you and I have talked before. You said that of all the hands to be dealt, you really would, for what's going on in Asia, what's going on in Europe, you'd rather deal with this hand. Another hand that you'd like to be dealt is in Boston, and we have students here that have come from all around the world. Why is Boston a place that you're especially bullish on for long term?
I think I'll give you a general answer, and I'll give you a more specific answer. The general answer is that we live in a cognitive era where intellectual talent and brain power is more important for economic success than it's ever been before, and that Boston, with all its universities and all its colleges, stands out for how much of that it possesses. And that means that we've got a ton of capacity to be prosperous, and we've got enduring sources of real strength. If you say, what are the chances that Microsoft will be a huge, important central company 75 years from now? Nobody who thinks about the long-term history of economics could think that that was better than a 50-50 shot, and it's probably less than a 50-50 shot. If you ask, what's the prospect that Harvard will be a great institution that will be highly prominent 50 years from now, 75 years from now, you'd have to say that was really likely. Mm-hmm. And so our having institutions that have real and profound staying power as mainstays of our economy, I think that has to make you optimistic about us. That's the general answer. The specific answer is this. The 20th century was a century of physics. Nuclear power, the atomic bomb, the semiconductor, the internet. The 21st century is a century of the life sciences. It is a century where genomics, stem cells, revolutions in neuroscience, the use of bacteria to synthesize materials. It will be a century of the life sciences. And if you draw a circle with this place as the center, right where we are now, and an 8-mile radius, there's more life science talent within that circle of 200 square miles than any 200-mile circle anywhere on this planet. And that gives our city the opportunity that Florence had 6 centuries ago, 7 centuries ago, not to be the biggest city in the world, not to be the richest city in the world, but to be the city where the acts of creation that make the biggest difference for the future of humanity are. And it's right here with all the life science talent that we have. And the question for this city is whether we are going to seize that opportunity or not. When I was a student at Harvard as a graduate student in the 1970s, if you had said there was going to be something like Silicon Valley, everybody would have assumed that it was going to be around Route 128, and they'd have all been wrong. And it's heavily because of a set of mistakes that we made of being overly punitive to businesses, of universities that hated cooperating with the private sector, of an insufficient amount of affordable housing. There were a variety of mistakes that we made. And the question, given our lead, our extraordinary lead in the life sciences, is whether we are going to seize the opportunity to be the place where cancer is turned into a chronic disease, Alzheimer's is a memory, and where the world is transformed. And that is mostly about talent, and we have the talent. And the question is whether we're going to support it, whether we're going to find the means of cooperation, whether we're going to nurture it, whether we're going to grow it. And that's a central question for this city. And it's a central question for the future of this university. It's biology departments, it's medical school, it's affiliated hospitals. But I'm optimistic that we can do it.
I love your optimism on that, and I love your pragmatism when it comes to everything else. So thank you, Larry. This has been a fantastic conversation. Some of my takeaways, if I could summarize quickly, one is your philosophy of looking at things as they are rather as you want them to be, and the importance that the sort of insidious influence that can otherwise have when looking at the future. That the overall, there's a lot of optimism in a lot of what you said, including looking globally at what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Asia, that things are tough here, and it looks like from your experience and your research that there will be a recession within 2 years, that the Fed is taking these steps, but what's going on in the US is a lot better than going in other places, that there are some fundamental infrastructure things that we should really be investing in now that will help, not necessarily in staving off a recession, but in keeping the country and the economy growing going forward, and that we can all do our part to make this region and beyond globally to be a place where the goal of your work is not to predict, you predict what happens with the goal of helping to prevent the worst of it from happening. And so hopefully your predictions and your calculations and your work and the ability that you have to communicate and to teach others what you've been thinking about, it really does help for a soft landing. So thank you all. This was a really great conversation.